Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening on what has really become wintry weather now. So, yes, we do appreciate you all making the effort for coming. My name is Norani Lejan. I'm Director here of the Information Law and Policy Centre. And before we start with this evening, I just want to highlight our presence on social media, on Twitter. I'm sure you may all be already following us, but if you're not, so keep up with events and all the other projects we have going on, you can find us there. And while I have your attention, we do have another very exciting event taking place here next Thursday. It's the launch of Professor Lillian Edwards' book on Internet Law and Policy, which is next Thursday. I hope you can join us for that. For this evening, as you may have seen from our panel, we have had a slight change in plans in terms of who will be speaking this evening. Unfortunately, Stephen Cave is unable to join us from Cambridge, and Sheena Urwin, unfortunately, from the Durham Constabulary is unfortunately very ill. So she sends her apologies and is hoping to join us for another event. But I will say this for people who were specifically interested in talking about predictive policing, that we've been doing some work in this area, and it would be fantastic to hear any questions or comments or discussions from the floor in terms of predictive policing. But in terms of our revised panel for this evening, we are absolutely delighted, to have Professor Jane Winters with us, who's Professor of Digital Humanities here at the School of Advanced Studies. She is involved in a number of projects in this area, but there's so many, it's difficult to prioritise, Jane, but I will just pick a few quite specifically relevant to this evening, in that she's been recently involved in the Big UK Domain Data for the Arts and Humanities project, digging into linked parliamentary metadata, and traces through time. I'm going to take my time with this one, Jane. Prosopography in practice across big data. Was that all right?
That's perfect.
Okay, not too bad. And a whole wide range of other fantastic projects in this area. She's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a member of the Research Infrastructure for the Study of the Archive Web group. Her research areas also include digital history, web archives, big data for humanities research, peer review in the digital environment, text editing, and the use of social media in the academic context, and also open access publishing. So as you can see from Professor Winter's slides, we're going to be taking a very specific focus in this presentation from the AI report regarding the role of the humanities and how that was addressed in the report and the implications of that afterwards. I'm also delighted to have joining us this evening Dr. Rachel Adams. Dr. Rachel Adams is our early career researcher at the Information Law Centre here at the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies. And her areas of research span from transparency and surveillance to human rights in the post-colonial context, also in terms of gender and AI. And she will be speaking to us this evening also on a related topic to the digital humanities, but also focusing on harms and gender and good governance within AI as well. So in terms of format for this evening, both Jane and Rachel will be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, or even longer, because we have this extra time on our hands, but at the same time, we don't want to take away from the Q&A and discussion afterwards, because this is a very significant report, as I'm sure you all know. It's incredibly expansive. It deals and covers with so many topics, everything from predictive policing, to open data, to data trust, in terms of good governance, in terms of the new policy centres that have been set up in order to implement and forward these projects, in order to work in closer coordination with the established centres like the Alan Turing Institute. And in many ways, this is a report that is in essence a blueprint for the strategy for AI for the UK going forward. And we have the obstacles that we may already be aware of in terms of AI and its development and its good governance, but we also then have the unexpected developments that will come down the next few years, such as Brexit and the impact, and the report does briefly mention that, but it is going to be quite an interesting area in terms of ensuring that the UK is in this position of being a leader of research and innovation in this space, while also maintaining ties in terms of research collaboration and networks and attracting the very best from the different relevant academic fields worldwide to ensure that that happens. So we have a number of different challenges and a number of different benefits in which we can talk about tonight in the way in which AI is serving society. And we'd really love to hear all of your views and feedback on that as the evening progresses. So it is my absolute pleasure to invite Jane to kick us off this evening.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that very generous introduction. I will start by saying I cannot answer any questions on predictive policing, so those are going to need to go to Nora when we get to that stage. So I'm really going to be talking about what the humanities can bring to the table when we're talking about artificial intelligence. And as a humanities researcher, it was really great to see the House of Lords report acknowledging that there are these sort of knotty issues that humanities is particularly able to help us think through and conceptualise. So the main areas that I'm going to be looking at are historicising the development of artificial intelligence. How do we think about influencing the quality of public debate and discussion? Because I think there's often some very uninformed, alarmist, plain wrong sometimes debate about artificial intelligence and a particular journalistic stance that's not terribly helpful in thinking through very complex issues. And that's not journalists' fault necessarily, because simplicity in a story that's easy to transmit is what sells newspapers, but it's not what helps us think through these thorny issues. What specific skills do the humanities bring to the table? And I think there are a lot, but we're not always terribly good at articulating what those might be. Really, what was at the core of that report, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot, the ethical implications of online research and application, actually, I should put there. It's not just about research, it's about how it's used and who's using it and for what purposes. And I'm also going to do that terrible thing because it was such a wide-ranging, well-written, thoughtful report, but I'm still going to pick on something that I didn't include, which is the arts and cultural heritage, which is the area where I've been most exposed to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think there was still, even though the humanities was mentioned, there's still that STEM focus in this area that means that some other areas of interest get overlooked and left out of the discussion. Okay, so turning to the history of AI, I'm a historian by training, so I was absolutely delighted to see that this report begins by historicising developments of AI. And they highlight this boom and bust cycle that's been going on through this kind of research since its inception. And that is really useful, I think, because it counteracts this idea of the inevitable progression of technology, the technological determinism, that it's always improving, and we're always on this sort of upward progression. Some things haven't worked. Sometimes government have thought this is a good thing to invest in, other times they haven't. There are all these other factors at play in how we've ended up where we are. And some of the things they highlight, that logic-based approaches are starting to come back into fashion again, whereas machine learning and neural networks have been very dominant until recently. And that's a reminder that the thing we think is going to crack this problem wide open now may not be what we think will do that in 2 years' time. And we may be looking back and reassessing earlier approaches and thinking, well, it didn't work in that context, perhaps we didn't have enough computing power at the time, but now those ideas can help us get to where we want to go to. And that's why this sense of the history is really important. I think with digital research, we're so focused on the now that we forget that other people have been thinking about these questions previously, and there are things that we can learn. But I think we should usefully take it further back, actually. There's a much wider and longer history of attitudes towards artificial intelligence and artificial life. And I'm aware that I'm slightly conflating the intelligence and life aspects here. There's evidence of fascination with artificial life right through human history and culture. It's not unique to the late 20th, early 21st century. This is something that people have always thought about very carefully. Just talking to Rachel earlier, I was aware that my sort of, what I thought was quite an extensive range of examples is terribly Eurocentric. So there we have a lack of diversity already in my thinking about this. But we go back to ancient Greece with Pygmalion and his ivory statue that has life breathed into it. There's a really rich history of automata, and some of those take on artificial life in the stories and myths around them. Pinocchio, children know about Pinocchio, that's artificial life, artificial intelligence. And science fiction, there are so many examples, but the ones that I've chosen, 2001 and the Alien series. And again, whenever AI is discussed in film and television and literature, it tends to be either this wonderful utopian solution that makes everybody's lives better, or it's absolutely terrible and we end up in dystopian and disaster very quickly. And finally, it seems fitting in its 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein, that Frankenstein's monster and artificial life and artificial intelligence is really, that's had a huge impact on popular culture. So I'm also aware that this is the kind of general artificial intelligence that the report makes very clear that it's not dealing with. It's not that kind of overarching intelligence that's going to transform the world. It's the individual, narrow-focused AI that's designed to deal with particular problems. But whether we like it or not, these are the narratives that shape public perceptions around artificial intelligence and how they relate to them, whether they fear them, whether they're hopeful about them. So I don't think we can dismiss these popular understandings and misunderstandings about artificial intelligence. And I just wanted to include this quotation from Frankenstein, because Frankenstein's monster is completely self-taught, and he reflects on the process. And I think this is a rather nice description of effectively artificial intelligence and a poor training data set, which leads to, as you know, it doesn't end well in the book. He learns by listening to a book being read out in Volney's Ruins of Empire. And it goes, through this work I obtained a cursory knowledge of history and a view of the several empires at present existing in the world. It gave me insight into the manners, governments and religions of the different nations of the earth. And here we get to the problematic stuff I heard of the slothful Asiatics, and we've got racism and Western centrism in there straight away. Or the stupendous genius and mental activity of the Grecians, the wars and the wonderful virtue of the early Romans, with their subsequent degeneration, but the decline of that mighty empire, the chivalry, Christianity, and the kings again, facing Christianity, hierarchy, structures. I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Sappho, who's the old man who's been read to, over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants. So finally we get some empathy in there towards the end, but that's in the context of the recent American Revolution, so it's probably more aimed at showing how bad the American colonists are, rather than really sympathy for what happened to the indigenous peoples. And that is an example, if your training data set is flawed, then you're going to get flawed results, particularly in a machine learning self-teaching environment. So people have been thinking about these questions for a very long time. Okay, so thinking about the public debate then, and I think the report really hits straight on this very early on page 6, and it's derived from some of those popular culture meanings and ideas. Many of the hopes and fears presently associated with AI are out of kilter with reality. Simply saying that isn't going to change things. We really need to work very hard to make sure that these unrealistic expectations of both dystopia and utopia are dealt with. The representation of artificial intelligence in popular culture is light years away from the often more complex and mundane reality. Journalism doesn't like the mundane, literature doesn't like the mundane. It's not surprising that we focus on these more exciting but not terribly realistic ideas. And related to that, and this again runs right through the report on skills training, is the need to improve digital understanding and data literacy, because we're really going to be in trouble if people cannot understand how they can use and relate to these new technologies. It's really not surprising that these sort of ideas are prevalent. I did a Google image search for artificial intelligence. These are the top results, and they're almost all focused on the relation of AI and the human. It's an embodied artificial intelligence, which is really not what we're thinking about or dealing with. It won't be for a very long time in this era. But this is what people think of when they think of artificial intelligence. And I would lay odds that most of you have seen an artificial intelligence article in a newspaper illustrated with a picture of the metal skeleton of Terminator. That seems to be a go-to image for newspapers when they're dealing with artificial intelligence. So that immediately sets the tone of the debate, and that's the kind of thing we need to address. I also looked at The Guardian for all the stories that have been tagged with artificial intelligence. There are 931 altogether, and I think it's fair to say it's pretty alarmist. We have, is the Chinese billionaire Jack Ma using AI to create dystopian cities? The truth about killer robots. Ruled by robots is easy to imagine. Can we trust artificial intelligence lie detectors? Computers have learned to make us jump through hoops. We thought fake news was bad, deep fakes are where truth goes to die. And finally, Britain funds research into drones that decide who they kill. So that's not a terribly nuanced, popular mainstream media coverage of artificial intelligence. This is where people are getting their information about AI from. Actually, even when you get to a slightly less bad one, quite far down, world's first AI presenter unveiled in China, that clearly then sparks up wider conversations about replacing labour. If the AI can read the news, why do we use it then? So it's not a happy, positive, or even terribly realistic story. There is much better coverage, but it's not framed in terms of AI. This is under national grid and electricity, and it's about drones being used to spot flaws in the infrastructure and see where the overhead cables might be down and so on. And that's a mundane, narrow AI, focused way of dealing with this, but you're not going to find it if you're looking for artificial intelligence in newspapers. I just happened to see that one on the front page a week or so ago. So the stuff that's relevant and realistic is buried. So what can we as humanities researchers do to help address some of these problems? And again, this was music to my ears, as you would expect. The report notes the importance of arts and humanities subjects, which hone the creative, contextual and analytical skills, which will likely become more, not less, important in a world shaped by AI. It highlights linguistic skills in particular, and a lot of tech companies are starting to say that what they really want is more languages graduates, because the skills they have in interpreting artificial language as well as human languages is incredibly useful, and the logic of thinking about how code is constructed is very related to linguistics. We have a problem in the UK. Modern languages teaching is hugely under threat. It's a subject that's being taught in increasingly few schools. I suspect that may get worse in the coming years as we move toward, or slightly away from Europe and thinking about European languages. So that's a subject that we really need to think about if we're looking at improving the skills base in the UK for dealing with artificial intelligence research and really making a contribution. And of course, I don't need to tell any of you here that legal expertise, which is not explicitly flagged up as a humanities contribution, but of course certainly in the work that Laura and Rachel are doing, is incredibly important in developing the frameworks that will help us to deliver this safely, effectively, and usefully. This was echoed by a recent report on the right skills by the British Academy, where it picked out in particular that arts, humanities and social science graduates can bring an understanding of the human consequences of developments such as artificial intelligence. So there's starting to be some discussion about what we need to do to make sure that we don't lose those skills and have a deficit in those particular areas, which don't seem immediately relevant to artificial intelligence, but are clearly very important. On ethics, this goes back to my training data set that I called from Frankenstein. Prejudices have been passed to not be unwitting skills integrated into systems. And I think it's that unwittingly that's very important. Most people, I would like to think, are not deliberately building terrible prejudices into artificial intelligence and machine learning, but without the understanding of the data that algorithms are drawing on, then you are unwittingly causing problems. I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a moment. We need to think about the ethical management and use of data, and that was right the way through the report as well, including de-identification where appropriate and possible. I think discussion around that, and the report gets to a lot of it, this idea, on the one hand, anonymisation is impossible to, yes, of course we can anonymise things. It's never, there's shades of grey, and again, as the report points out, in some cases, if you anonymise the data, it ceases to be useful for research. So it isn't as straightforward as always having to anonymise or de-identify. It's about making sure that it's done with due consideration of the value and importance of the research, because that might mean that where you wouldn't de-identify, where you would de-identify in some instances, because this research is particularly important and useful for a particular community, for example, then that might be an ethical moment. We need to have a lot more conversation about that, and about the combination of data sets that feed artificial intelligence, what linking things up might do, and why some people are more averse to being identified than others. Some people are entirely happy to have information about them shared and used, and other people aren't. We can't treat it as a one-size-fits-all situation. I think we all need to think a bit more about the data that people generate as they go about their lives. We're all transmitting data from our phones and our computers as we walk around a city, and it picked up by Wi-Fi points, all of that information. And people need to be educated to make informed decisions about what they're happy to be used and used. Because if you don't know that you're generating data, then you're not going to be able to think carefully about what's interacting with it, or even be aware that research is possible in that area. And this again is something that I thought was a real strength of the report, is talking about the intelligibility and describability of AI systems that are often so complex that the developers responsible for them aren't able to describe or and work out how a machine's arrived at a particular conclusion. There's inevitably going to be some black box elements to this. If we're sophisticated enough to do some of the things we want AI to do, then we're not going to be able to describe all of it. But we do need to think very carefully about how we're describing in ways that people can understand. Otherwise, it's no different to magic, essentially. If you have no idea how something's working, you really can't relate to it. So what can go wrong if you don't get this stuff right? Some of you may have seen this story where an apparently anonymised set of logs about New York City cab journeys was released, and it took 2 hours for someone to re-identify 173 million taxi trips, thereby making sure that you could track individual drivers' journeys, you could work out their gross income for the year, you could see who was maybe not picking up as many fares as they should be, or wasn't moving too far away from home, or was turning down fares. And that was a data set where they had made an attempt to de-identify, so they were trying to behave responsibly, and still within 2 hours, that's a lot of information about people's livelihoods that's available on the web for anyone to do what they want with. That's why we need to really think about the relationship between making data open as well. That's something else the report touches on. That data needs to be made open if there are risks of re-identification. I don't know if this conversation's been had, but it's an example of where that can go very badly wrong with data management. Some of you may have seen this company, which has a terrible name, I think, of Faceception. And it says, we reveal personality from facial images at scale to revolutionise how companies, organisations, and even robots understand people, and dramatically improve public safety, communications, decision-making, and experiences. It's honestly sounding fairly unachievable at the moment. That doesn't sound too alarming. It's to interact with computers more effectively. But its facial personality analysis is really not that far away from this example, which again some of you may have seen a couple of years ago. New AI can guess whether you're gay or straight from a photograph with a 91% degree of accuracy. In my view, that's a piece of research that should never have happened. I can't see a reason why you would want to do that, and certainly if you made that research available to a country where it's still illegal to be homosexual and can result in very, very serious criminal trials, then that's completely irresponsible. I don't know why you would do that. It's dangerous. They should never have got through an ethics review board, in my opinion. But that's at one end of the spectrum, but you can see how it relates on some of these other areas, and people aren't thinking sufficiently clearly about the potential uses of what they're doing. Someone had a great idea. Let's do this. That'd be interesting. We can probably do it. But why would you do it? Why should you do it? And those conversations need to happen a lot more, and I think humanities can really bring something to that. So what can we do? Rather than just saying, oh, the humanities can bring something, which is what I hear a lot of my colleagues saying, and I've been guilty of this as well, I think we need to do a much better job of saying, well, yes, but what precisely is that? Why is it useful for an AI developer or a researcher to come and talk to a historian or an English literature academic or a linguist? We need to say precisely what it is that we can bring to the table. I think we should focus a bit less on catastrophising, which is actually what I've just been doing. Actually, this is what happens when you don't involve us. It's all terrible. And think a bit more about the societal and cultural benefits of AI and how we can help those to be delivered more effectively. So it's about enabling rather than preventing. So I think sometimes developers see the humanities contribution as being saying, no, you can't do that. It's always stopping people from doing something, saying, no, don't do that just yet, you need to think about all these other things first. And that can very soon settle into, let's not ask them, they'll just tell us not to do it. So it has to be an enabling relationship, I think, it's going to work. We need to provide forums for discussion and collaboration between all of the interested parties. And that's why an event like this is so great, because you're bringing people together to try and talk through some of these ideas. And don't tack humanities on at the end. Don't write a funding application to develop a new machine learning technique and then look at it and say, oh, we're supposed to be interdisciplinary, should we ask a couple of historians? Or wait until something's gone badly wrong and then say, maybe we should get some ethics checking on this. So I think that those conversations need to be done right from the outset, in a real exchange of knowledge between all of the people involved, and we'll end up in a much better place than if we try to do this separately. So what can we bring, having said we need to be more specific? I think understandings of the public and the private and changing perceptions around public space and privacy, and how it's not common across different cultures, different geographical regions. That's something that historians have been thinking about public space from really the Middle Ages onwards, how people interact in public space, how they expect information to be treated and passed on, where they get their sources of information from, what are the criteria that they use to check whether it's trustworthy or not. So, and you know, the nuances of working in a digital space, and it might be legally public, but do people actually realise it's public? And is that the same across all education and age ranges? So that's something that we can talk about in detail. There are very mature fields of research that look at the relationship between humans and technology over time, for example, around the impact of the Industrial Revolution, and all of those questions that we've had periodically throughout Western history, certainly, of great leaps in technology leading to job losses, and disenfranchising people and de-skilling people. And that's not to make those simplistic arguments that you sometimes hear about, well, the internet's just like printing press, isn't it? I don't think that really helps anybody, but it is thinking through the relationship between people and technology and learning how to counter some of those arguments about everyone's going to lose their jobs, because in human history to date that has not happened. Some people have lost their jobs, new jobs have been created, some people have been left behind, some people have been trained. We know how this has worked in the past, and we can perform how to prepare for it in the future. We have a deep understanding of a lot of the data that's being used to train AI, particularly, for example, Google using all of the Google Books data, 18th and 19th and 20th century books and literature. We know how they were produced, where they were produced, by whom they were produced, what sort of biases that they might have in them, what that might do to your artificial intelligence. So we can help with that. I've had, this is very simplistic, but colleagues occasionally, whenever it turns out that a new machine learning algorithm turns out to produce racist results, and a colleague will say, well, just come talk to me, I could have told them that. And that's a not very helpful way of thinking about it, but that's why those conversations need to happen. Consideration of bias is something that's absolutely at the heart of humanities research. And I think acceptance that it is not possible to eliminate bias is something with which historians, for example, are very comfortable. We know that nothing is produced in a vacuum. It's always a product of a society, the particular local cultural context of the person responsible for generating information. So trying to think of producing unbiased data, unbiased algorithms, in my view, is just not possible. There are always going to be biases, but we need to know what they are, how we can work with them, and how we can mitigate the effects, rather than trying to aim for some unachievable, unbiased state, which has never been possible to do before. Questions of diversity, Rachel's going to talk about some of this, around gender, race and ethnicity, social backgrounds. Again, that's a really central interest in humanities, and we need to feed that in, and again, we've seen what happens when we don't, and there was the example of the Google AI that couldn't identify black people effectively in researchers because of the data it had been trained on. And again, we can't always get rid of these problems, we can't always make sure that everything is fair equally to everybody, but we can help to understand that and interpret it and mitigate the consequences of the negative. And in my experience, this is something which kind of upsets computer scientists. apologies again, you're in the room, that we're really comfortable with uncertainty and fuzziness and not knowing things and realising that you can't get a right solution to something. And I think that's a very important element to introduce into these discussions. Moving on then to what was missing, and I think this can be very important for the UK culturally, but also economically. The creative industries and the arts generate a huge amount of money for the UK, if you want to look at it in kind of treasury-friendly terms. This is a fantastic initiative. It's an experimental album of Irish traditional music and some computer-generated tunes, where the algorithm had been trained on 23,000 transcriptions of traditional Irish music to see what it could produce. And I was fortunate enough to be at an event at the Human Festival in School of Advanced Study last year, where we had a folk group who played some of these tunes and asked the audience to identify which were the computer-generated tunes. And nobody could tell the difference. And it was really interesting, and there were some people who said, oh yes, of course it's that one, but it was really guesswork in the end. You couldn't tell because it was exposed to the same influences that the musicians had been exposed to. And so that is machine learning that's generating something creative. There was some intervention from the musicians as well. In some areas they had to kind of tidy things up a little bit. And I think that's interesting when you get artificial intelligence and creative artists working together to produce something that's different or better than might have been done independently. And again, that's an area of thinking about creating new opportunities and new jobs rather than saying, oh no, the AI can write music, we won't need musicians in 2 years' time. It's about working creatively together. Poetry is another area. This headline is deliberately misleading. There's an AI capable of writing poetry that's pretty woeful, by which they meant full of woe rather than terrible, although arguably it is pretty terrible as well. Show you some examples. The AI was exposed to photographs and these are the poems that it produced. This one is inspired by a pastoral landscape at the bottom. The sun is shining, the wind moves, naked trees you dance. That's pretty terrible, but you could imagine a school child writing a poem like that, and humans write pretty terrible poetry. And again, they tested this on, some humans do, some humans write brilliant poetry. And this again was run past specialist literature scholars and ordinary people to see if they could tell which were the machine-generated poems and which were the ones written by humans. And again, they couldn't always, not with 100% success. The specialists did better, but even they couldn't always tell what had been generated by a computer. This is the area that I work in most at the moment, which is how we can use artificial intelligence and cultural heritage, which is a wonderful virtuous circle with understanding the data that then goes on to be used to feed the artificial intelligence, and then using all of that historical material to inform artificial intelligence. It's increasingly important for heritage organisations because they're at the front line of dealing with the huge amounts of digital data that they're going to be getting from government departments, for example. And it is not going to be possible to catalogue and describe that material in the way that archivists have spent the last 500 or 600 years doing archives. There's too much of it, it's too complicated, too overwhelming, too unstructured. They're not going to be able to do it, so they have to find alternatives. The National Archives of the UK, I think, is really world-leading in this, and that's another area that we should be talking about proudly as something that we can do well in the UK. And they've been testing automated sensitivity reviewing for digital archives, and that's been achieving results at least as good as those of human cataloguers who do a very smaller set of data to work with. And I think that's an interesting reminder to us that humans aren't always right. Humans make mistakes too. Artificial intelligence makes mistakes, machine learning produces erroneous results, but people also get stuff wrong. So acknowledging that and working together, I imagine that's what's going to happen in this case. There'll still be human checking, human cataloguers will get freed up to do the stuff that the artificial intelligence can now help with. So that should be a benefit to everybody working in that sector. And they've wrote some fantastic reports about how they've implemented that, which is on the website. And finally, this is something experimental research that I've been talking to them about recently, which is identifying digital documents at scale, not by analysing the text, particularly if that's handwritten medieval manuscripts and so on, but by identifying the elements on the page and their spatial relationship to each other using logic-based artificial intelligence. So that we can scan through a huge set of data and say that's a letter, that's a charter, that's a government paper, that's an email, that's a memo, that's a book. So seeing if we can use artificial intelligence to help us categorise this kind of data and make archives more effectively in the future. So, and all of that, I think, brings us back to where I started out in terms of what the humanities can bring, and also the humanities questions for me that are running right the way through this report, which is trust, intelligibility, ethical handling of personal and sensitive data, skills training, and the value of the humanities being involved in those discussions and conversations. I think this clear focus in the report on ethical AI is the area that we're best suited and I think crucially very because we can't compete much with national investments to carve out a leading role and really set the standard for ethical work in this area, and I think that would be a huge contribution to artificial intelligence research. And I really like the way they phrased it. This would play to our particular blend of national assets, alongside a very strong tradition of computer science research in our universities. We also have world-leading humanities departments who can provide valuable insight and context regarding the ethical and societal implications of AI. And that seems like a good motivation. Thank you very much.
Jane, thank you so much. You covered just so much ground there, and thanks for the nod to the legal scholarship contribution. We definitely do what we can. I mean, there's so many thoughts that came to mind during your presentation. I really liked the point you made about the social scientists and lawyers, some of the time, not all of the time, but this comfortableness with a lack of certainty, and this comfortableness with basically knowing that a project is ongoing, whether you're talking about a new technical application of AI or whether you're talking about the framework within that works. I've had a number of conversations with engineers in this. Anyone an engineer here or a scientist? One. Is it just you?
Apparently.
Are we all? Are we other lawyers here? Oh, okay. Good. Well represented. And then from the social sciences, just kind of interesting breakdown. So the conversations with scientists and engineers, when we talk about trust and intelligibility and ensuring good governance, is that, and I'll come to this from a data protection legislative point of view when I talk to them about the fact that you're processing data, personal data, it's not anonymous, so you need to have an impact assessment because you've got this huge data set, like the ones that Jane was talking about earlier on, about millions of records concerning millions of people. And I mean, I think sometimes I feel as soon as I mention data protection to them, their eyes glaze over just slightly, or there's this look of concern on their face of what do we need to do? You know, there's this concern of burden, for example, because there's also uncertainty for them, because it's never a straightforward process. It's about thinking about the impact and the implications that this particular device or this particular database might have, and the way in which you can build in less certainty or take out less certainty, for example. And it made me think of the example you gave about getting rid of bias. There's a lot of literature out there right now in terms of how we can design AI-driven systems that are not biased, as opposed to taking the other approach that is very well established in the humanities and from so many ethicists that you will talk to, that these systems are products of their environment in terms of the biases, but also in terms of the humans that they interact with and the human systems. So to bring it back to law and predictive policing, one of the ways in which that was attempted in the US was that in order to address inherent discrimination against certain groups in society, in this case African Americans, what we will do is in these data sets, we'll omit race. We'll make sure that that's something taken out of the data sets as much as is possible, but also when we analyze it, we're not going to prioritize race as a specific category. And this is at the heart of this problem, about thinking that, well, if we take this particular piece of data out, then that's going to help make this system more fair. when crucially it's not just about taking out that one sliver of information, because the way a lot of these systems work for predictive policing is you have these huge data sets taken from lots of different areas, taken from parole officers, taken from social media, for example. They're very wide, they're very different, there's a lot of context collapse because they're coming from different areas. And you can get information about somebody's race or gender or their identity through combining lots of other information. Postcodes, for example, in particular areas will immediately identify, in a lot of cases, combining that with lots of other data sets. So the question is less about taking out different parts of information to make things less biased, as opposed to what safeguards are you going to put in place to deal with this, because this is going to be an inevitable result of combining these huge data sets, because you're combining human behavior, biases we already have within society, but then you're also considering how these systems work. So there does need to be a lot more joined up thinking in this area and on the societal impacts and how we deal with them, and to be more comfortable with knowing that there is uncertainty and how we can address them and do it together. So on that note, Rachel, it would be wonderful to hear you talk about the more societal implications.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Jane, for such a fascinating presentation that I think will lead into some of the points I'm going to make, which is not going to be as nicely structured, but hopefully covers some of the issues. I think this idea of ethics I'm going to keep coming back to, because it's a term that is coming up in almost any policy document that is emerging with regards to anything to do with the digitalisation of society. And we're almost reaching a point where there's a crisis in terms, and ethics has become a stop for all sorts of potential and possible harm, and we're placing everything into this box of ethics. But what does ethics mean? Can a universal code of ethics be developed, or is ethics relative, and is it localized in different contexts? So there's been some recent discussion from somebody called Mona Sloan, who's at LSE, who talks about how it is not sufficient to combine the input from technical experts and cognitive scientists with moral philosophy in order to code ethics into AI. So, for example, to take race out of the whole algorithm. Ethics is something we do, it's something that's practiced, it's a responsibility that's behest on the shoulders of those with powers, of the companies that produce and research AI, or the governments that seek to regulate it or use it within their own systems. It's a responsibility to act and to do things and to make decisions in certain ways that take into account the broad and the specific moral impacts of what may happen as a result of specific decisions. And I think the practical side of what ethics means, that ethics is a practice, is often lost in policy documents that seek to concretize in specific terms something as broad and as fluffy and as uncertain as ethics. So there's just a couple of points that I want to bring up. You know, in terms of this role of the arts and cultures, which is emphasised in the report, but I think could be emphasised more. And I think that it is very Eurocentric. But I think also this idea that the report raises at the beginning in terms of the imagined impact of artificial intelligence far exceeds the reality of what we're facing with, and that the narratives, as you spoke about, the narratives that we have from fiction or from film fall into these binaries of dystopia or utopia. Well, that's an area for the arts and humanities and the arts and cultures to come in to think about new narratives, more nuanced narratives about the ways in which humans interact with artificial intelligence, noting that there's been a whole history of many thousands of years of the relationships between humans and the technologies they design to help us, and the abilities and powers that are invested in technologies that then supersede what humans believe their own intelligence to be. Now, the other thing I wanted to pick up on was something around the work Nora and I are doing. I think one of the key policy takeaways from the report was the idea that was the recommendation to the Competitions and Markets Authority to look into the monopolisation of data by the 5 big technology giants that are operating in the UK. And for me, I'm not sure that this recommendation goes far enough. I think they have a monopoly not only over data, but over the products that, the AI products that are on sale and are in the market today, one of which that Laura and I have been looking into is these virtual personal assistants like Siri and Alexa and Cortana that come from Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon. Yeah.
Alexa.
Yeah, and you can see that there's a monopolisation of the market in terms of these 3 VPAs have all been designed and developed in very similar ways. There's not a sort of variety or nuance of different VPAs that people can choose from in the market. They have to choose a feminized, arguably sexualized VPA with a female name and a female voice. Automatically they can choose to make it a male, but it comes automatically as female and with female characterization. So I think that's another area where a monopolization of the market can lead to potential social harms. And then speaking about women, or speaking about social harms in terms of gender, I also thought that the report really didn't go far enough in this regard. And I think, you know, the report was so carefully written up to be as diplomatic as possible, and sometimes that can be very beneficial, but sometimes it means that you don't name the specific problems we're facing with in terms of race and in terms of gender, and instead lump it under this term diversity, which is the more politically neutral term, which then becomes problematic in itself. So women was mentioned twice in the report, which I think doesn't go far enough, considering that the artificial intelligence that we can have in our homes, our Siris and our Alexas and our Cortanas, are decisively gendered female, so there's already a decisive issue there with regards to gender. And then, you know, this recent issue on the news of the man who murdered his wife. I think it happened earlier this year in Middlesbrough, I was looking it up. The man who murdered his wife, and then they were able to work out that it was him that had murdered her by the data on his phone. So he had planned this attack over many, many years, and then he wanted to stage it to look like a burglary, and so they looked at his health app on his phone, which showed that after the murder had taken place, he had run frantically around the house. You could see his heart rate had gone up, and he'd moved different areas, and he's climbed all over the steps to make it look like a burglary. And then on her phone of the victim, the data just stopped. Nothing had happened, she hadn't moved. And then I think sort of half an hour later, there was a corresponding 12 steps of movement between her and him. And either she'd taken his phone, he'd taken his phone, and he'd taken her phone and dumped it in the bin. But the point is that these kinds of technologies can be used in both problematic ways, but also in enabling ways to address things like violence against women. And I thought that there was not enough emphasis put in the report on the ways in which artificial intelligence and related technologies could be used for the benefits of society, but more specifically to address the particular inequalities and discrimination that we are facing with today. Another point from Mona Sloan that I think is related, especially in terms of this idea of the inherent bias that we as humans carry with us and carry into the work that we do, the preconceived categories of meaning that we have and we draw upon in work that we try and be objective about. She talks about how the difference in what bias means in machine learning and what bias means in law, and she says that bias in machine learning refers to data that's been systematically diverging from the population it looks to represent, whilst in law, bias refers to the predisposition of a decision maker against or in favour of a particular party. So again, we're coming back to this idea of this blanket use of the term bias as naming the particular issue we're facing with, when actually there's different layers of meaning and understanding that's going on there that we need to look more carefully at framing and discussing. And then I think the other related issue here is in terms of the point you raised about data determinism, and this idea that with AI we're moving from a data-informed to a data-driven society. And data is coming to occupy this space as a kind of privileged source of knowledge and truth. And what this means for other knowledges, like the humanities, knowledges that may be more subjective or may maybe non-quantifiable. How does data and the privileging of data in artificial intelligence work to devalue and delimit other forms of knowledges? And how can we create space to ensure that these knowledges work together and inform each other, and that a more balanced view is arrived at or thought about? The last thing that I wanted to touch on, because it's my sort of specific area of interest, is what I think is one of the most important things the report is trying to say, which is that the UK is and should be a global leader in this area. The first line of the report is, our inquiry has concluded that the UK is in a strong position to be among the world leaders in the development of artificial intelligence during the 21st century. Constantly throughout the report, it talks about the UK as a leader. It echoes a number of other policy documents in this area, the Industrial Strategy White Paper, which speaks about the UK being at the forefront of AI and the data revolution, and stresses that the UK will lead the world in safe and ethical use of data and artificial intelligence, giving competence and clarity to citizens and businesses. Yet I don't think the report does a very good job in unpacking or clarifying what it means to be a world leader, or what they will do in this regard. So it's mentioned quite briefly in the last chapter. The first section, I think, looks at how the UK will lead at home, and then the second bit is what you talk about, and it talks about how the UK cannot be a world leader in terms of innovation because of the US and China, but neither the US or China are cannot be leaders on ethical issues, and it quotes how in the US the administration is not focused on the ethical issues of AI. So this is the space for the UK. But I really think that this isn't gone into in any detail in terms of what it means to be a leader. I've been in South Africa for the past 10 years, and I know from working in Parliament in South Africa that when South Africa are deliberating a new bill, a new piece of legislation, they've often taken studies tours to the UK to see how the UK have done it. And these types of very real situations in which the UK is looked to as a leader is not thought about in any detail or conceptualised in the report. It's as if the UK wants to be in a kind of arms race situation and wants to win the race in terms of being a shining star in ethics and AI. But it doesn't take into account how being a leader in this particular regard will leave other countries behind, will leave other places behind, and how it will bring those other places to the table and into these kinds of discussions. It doesn't talk about how it can learn from other parts of the world in terms of how they have addressed or thought about autonomous machines, or in terms of different kinds of intelligence, how they've grappled with those kinds of issues within their own narratives or fictions or culture. It doesn't talk about this at all. It simply talks about how the UK will be a leading example in terms of ethics. And I think, ethics has to be remembered as something that is relative and it is localised. It is not something that can, to an extent, it can be universally coded, but we've seen with human rights law how human rights does not translate into every part of the world in the same way. And I think we need to be careful about thinking about this. We have to look, perhaps with Brexit, we need to look at Commonwealth countries and how so many of these Commonwealth countries have developed biometric systems which register every single citizen through retina scans and through fingerprints. And what is the UK's role in leading these countries or showing these countries why biometrics may not be the most effective system, or what the consequences of this might be? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for again covering so much ground in terms of the scope of its report. Also very interesting to hear a more critical assessment of the report as well, because in one way it's its scale, the amount of areas that the House of Lords report covers is very impressive. It does cover so many topics. When you look at the report, its recommendations, the evidence from witnesses, the presentations, there are a huge amount of issues covered in it. But I think, as we've scratched on the surface here, taking that approach, taking that very sweeping, wide-scale approach, means that there's somewhat of a lack of detail that's gone into specific areas, and particularly areas that the report prioritizes, like, for example, being a global leader. And then when you scratch the surface on that, well, what does that actually mean? And Rachel explored, the implications there of the fact that, well, if we're going to be a leader, then inevitably that means leaving others behind. Or does it not? How do we address that? How do we make sure that we maintain very important research, collaborative networks if we want to be at the cutting edge of AI, which is an essential part of that? And I also really liked your point about the issue of monopolies. So in the report's final recommendations, there's an acknowledgement about how you have a danger regarding the centralization of power and influence of certain particular companies, and they're very much US multinationals. I think you listed the key ones just now, Rachel. And in the report, in terms of its recommendations, which are very significant because they effectively act like a blueprint for the government strategy in this area, there is quite an underwhelming recommendation that they will keep the harms and dangers posed by monopolies under review, and that's it in terms of the recommendation. And in terms of the follow-up to that, you have other areas then of the report that prioritize so much lifting SMEs and ensuring that, for example, they have all this access to these huge data sets from the public sector, from Transport for London, for example, open data sets. And that's where this conversation around data trusts is surfacing, because if SMEs in the UK, for example, could have this advantage, then this would give them a leg up against those monopolies. But to date, if you look at those who have had access to those data sets, who have they been? So first of all, Transport for London is put front and center as a very good example, and I cited it myself in terms of the way they've been enabled and structured themselves to provide data to SMEs. But one of the most popular and commercially successful apps, City Mapper, that arose out of that was from a former employee of Google, for example. And another example, which is ever so less positive, but it's a case study that the report actually does go into, and that's the access to 1.6 million records from the Royal Free Trust from the NHS that were given over to Google DeepMind a number of years ago. And the report makes abundantly clear that the lack of trust and the major data protection violations that happened here in terms of those patients not having given their consent, having no knowledge about the development of this app for doctors to more quickly identify, kidney dialysis, is something that we can't let have happen in the future. And as a result of that controversy, we saw, and this is following on from your point, Jane, that we need to make sure we're addressing these problems in advance, not reactively, not after the fact, not after the damage is done, not after the trustworthiness is lost, or we're asking too much of companies and also particularly the public in terms of exchanging this data away. And I have to say, I was very positive when I saw Google DeepMind appoint a data ethics board made up of scientists and other people from the humanities. I'm less excited about the fact that that's recently been abolished by Google, and that they have as yet not made a statement about its replacement. They've made the statement that they've abolished the board because they're going to be expanding their research into health data, and this particular board was very UK-centric. So that's not exactly the direction in which we want to be going in. Perhaps maybe as a leader in this field, it would be wonderful to see bodies calling on Google DeepMind to ask what the replacement would be in this particular space, and that it would encompass expertise from scientists, from the relevant engineers, from the medical specialists, that it would also involve cooperation, for example, by the new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation that has recently been established, that they would also maybe include a lawyer or two, maybe. We have some ideas sometimes that are helpful in terms of good governance and ethical due diligence. But you see here, this is old patterns repeating themselves. You know, this is old wine in new bottles in terms of the governance challenges. And in terms of the issue of monopolies and social harms, I was wondering, Jane, if you think that there's a particular role in the humanities that they could play in that space? I mean, do you think ethics boards is one actionable way to do that, like Rachel mentioned, or are there other ways?
I do think that's probably the best route in, having an awareness of where it has gone wrong in the past. Not necessarily in relation to artificial intelligence, but to privacy and data management generally. I think having that, what are the areas where these things can go wrong, and it's not a technological issue, it is a social, cultural, legal issue, and I think that's why it's important for lawyers and humanists generally to be included on these kinds of discussions. Absolutely. It's not as if we haven't had previous scandals in the UK about the management of information related to healthcare of organs. We know, and that's again not a technical issue. It's not a technology issue. So I think absolutely I would support it.
Rachel, just to follow on, so in the next edition of this report, there was a follow-on, and they have another consultation, and if evidence were to be submitted, do you think there are particular ways in which the UK could act as a global leader in the space of AI to, say, the global south, to other jurisdictions who could really benefit in terms of this kind of cooperation? But also, are there also mechanisms there whereby the UK can also draw from the experiences of other jurisdictions, the other approaches that they may have?
I think doing something like funding research in particular countries, part of the problem is that it's not such a high policy issue in for example, South Africa, but it's going to be something that greatly impacts South African society very soon. So I think bringing those kinds of places into the discussions through enhancing collaborations, enhancing research, enhancing links and networks, those kinds of things that just broaden the sort of scope of what they're looking at and whose ideas they're taking into account when they're putting together these kinds of reports.
Yes. No, I think that would be very welcome. I think that would definitely advance research here and also future collaborations. So I'm going to pick up on a slide in your presentation, Jane, about facial recognition. And it's more fun to do this because it wasn't the University of London involved in this study. It was Stanford University.
Yes.
Yes. So, in terms of the particular approach there, in terms of the ethics board, did it come out afterwards, for example, what that ethics assessment was? Because I imagine that was a focus of controversy.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything publicly. I imagine there must have been a huge discussion in the university, because it really, there was no positive spin put on that story in any newspaper that I saw. It's very hard to see. I think that the abiding thing was, well, what on earth were you thinking? How did that ever get anywhere near being put through? It baffles me how that happened. Something obviously went wrong. And I worry a little bit, even in a university like Stanford, and it's certainly the case here as well, that ethics boards are not always fully equipped to assess the ethical implications of some of this really innovative artificial intelligence research because of that lack of intelligibility sometimes. And I think people are being asked to make decisions that they're not really qualified to make about whether something is ethical or not. And we don't really always quite know what ethical is in this either. So it's very challenging for universities to deal with this question. But when you get it wrong, it's an international scandal about the kind of research that you're prepared to allow to go forward. But I don't know what kind of discussions they have, but I'm sure they will have looked at their ethics review processes.
So on a more positive note from the report, it's also very encouraging to see how much acknowledgement there is given to the role of the humanities, but also in the prioritization of the Alan Turing Institute in terms of the role it's going to play in terms of coordinating research and AI around the country. And they also have a dedicated capacity to looking into the implications of AI and ethics as well. Do you think there's a role for the Alan Turing Institute to provide greater guidance for universities in AI and ethics specifically, because of all the expertise that we have centralised there now and coordinated?
Absolutely, and there has certainly been much greater recognition of the need to get humanities researchers involved with the Turing Institute than there was when it started out. That's really changed since it started, and it's broadened its remit and the people that it's talking to in really helpful ways. I'm on a digital humanities and data science interest group, which doesn't have anything to do with the ethical side of things, but they are bringing humanities researchers into the discussions in really helpful ways. I think they're going to need more resource to do what's recommended in the report, that's the role that they should take, because it's definitely an expansion of what they were set up to do, and if it's not resourced properly, as with anything else, I think we're going to get into problems. But the fact that they are so well embedded in the university sector, I think will really help with that. Although individual universities are partners in the Turing Institute, it's not, and they have privileged access to research fellowships, for example. They're not open to anyone to apply for. It's only through the partner universities. So I don't know how that's going to be squared.
So the following point came up in both of your presentations, but given that transparency, Rachel, is an area that you do so much work in right now and that you've done so much work in the past, what did you think of the approach of the report to intelligibility in AI and dealing with that black box, opaque challenge? Because there are a number of suggestions put forward in terms of how it could be dealt with. Some of them are framed within data protection legislation, for example, in terms of meaningful explanations that could be given to individuals regarding significant decisions that impact upon them in terms of, say, creditworthiness, for example, decisions with regard to predictive policing, custody decisions, sentencing decisions, whether you are given a mortgage or not, for example, and this all comes back to profiling by AI in the way they're going to be shaping how we're all treated in society in different functions. Do you think that the report, or maybe a subsequent iteration of it, could go further in addressing what the role of transparency should be in this space?
Well, I think part of the problem is that they don't really know. The whole issue of black boxing is such terrible terminology. The new one is now white boxing, which is a transparent space. I find this terminology.
So we want a white box society.
So something that's white is transparent, and something that's black is untransparent. So it's hugely problematic terminology, whitelisting and blacklisting. So really problematic terminology, and I think my whole work has looked at the fact that transparency as a huge concept and such an important concept has been really under-theorised. We really don't quite know what it means. It's used metaphorically, and institution and algorithm cannot literally be see-through. So already we're talking at the level of metaphors when we use the word transparency. So I like the shift from using transparency as the word to using intelligibility and explainability, because I think that more carefully names what it's talking about, especially explainability. So I think the policy position at the moment was that if a decision is made by a system that you cannot understand where and how that decision was made, then, and it's a decision that's sensitive or very significant, that can't happen. Or, I think a lot of it goes under the issue of judicial review and rule of law and how you decide as to where and how a decision has been made and then how you hold it accountable. So I think that is the area that needs a lot more understanding, and we're not there yet in terms of how to solve it. It's a big issue that really hasn't yet been solved, but personally I think the move away away from using the word transparency to something more specific like explainability is better, and then stop using white box and black box.
Connected with that, I think there was an interesting shift away from talking about digital literacy to digital understanding.
Right, yes.
And I think, again, that's a much more helpful concept than, because I mean, for most of us, this is a black box. I couldn't begin to tell you how that works. If you understand the kind of the way its context, and you know that you can find an answer if you get, say, a decision that goes against you, that's what's important, rather than needing to understand exactly how the technology works. But I think we will get to a point where, I mean, you know, it's the same with other radio, television. If you know, we use them all the time, but most of us couldn't build one or explain how it works, or you know, so it's just the understanding of the framework within which it's working, and the decisions that have been made around it.
And what the consequences could be. I think transparency is just a very useful word for trying to claim that things can be understood and things can be simpler, and we're not so completely powerless, but it masks the complexity that these systems are to most people.
And you can make something really transparent, and if it's not accessible and intelligible, then you ticked a box that says we've made this transparent and open, but you haven't helped anyone understand it.
Which is happening with the open data that's only relevant and useful to the people that are highly trained in understanding particular data sets and how to reuse them.
Absolutely. And in terms of, I think, this ongoing narrative and dialogue about open data, and particularly data trusts, there's going to have to be a lot of focus on what you just mentioned about digital understanding, and then those who have the resources to make the most of these particular data sets. It is no good having this massive raw data dump to a small SME that don't have the resources to process that data or analyze it or understand what the value is to be extracted from it. But that very much suits, for example, a much larger company, a monopoly company, that does in fact have the resources to process and analyze. But then, of course, what's problematic there is that then you have that growing imbalance of power between the monopolies, what you mentioned earlier on, and smaller SMEs. And then you do have that growing imbalance then in terms of how competitive the economy is, and that need to make sure that the public sector is getting value, and not just financial value, but societal value out of this data. And those questions that will have to be had now in future, and the House of Lords report does make reference to this, public procurement, those conversations, those contracts between the private sector and the public sector need to become much more detailed and much more nuanced, and need to be asking all kinds of new questions because of the scale of the data and the value of it that's involved.